Welcome, everyone. My name is Lucas Ballman. I am presenting on the Mundell-Fleming model. Just a quick overview of the slides here. Initially, we'll start off covering the three curves that make up the model, the IS curve, the LM curve, and the VP curve. After that, we'll move on to the impossible trinity, then policy effectiveness, and finish up with model limitations. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to understand each component of the model, how they interact, and what the model tells us about real-world economic policy. So let's get into it. So what is the Mundell-Fleming model? Well, initially, there was the ISLM framework, which if you're not familiar, it was just a model to show how investment savings and demand of money interact with each other with interest rates and income and modeling all these important factors. But Robert Mundell and J. Marcus Fleming in the early 1960s independently developed upon this model to expand it for open economies with capital flowing across the border, which was a huge limitation of the initial model because you just don't see that in the real world of just a completely closed economy with no, exports, imports, or even foreign investment. The main purpose of this model is to help predict how interest rates, exchange rates, and output interact in the short run. And it can show whether fiscal or monetary policy is effective. And then that depends on whether the country is focused on a more fixed exchange rate or a floating exchange rate. And we'll cover more of that later, but first up, the three components of the model. The IS curve is derived from the goods market equilibrium condition of output equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And if you remember anything from macroeconomics, this is just the formula for GDP. And as you can see in the top right there, it is the downward sloping curve with interest rate being graphed on the y-axis and GDP or output being graphed on the x-axis. So into each piece that makes up the formula, consumption, C equals C0 plus C times disposable income. This can be a little confusing just reading it out, but it's C0 is the autonomous consumption. So this is bare minimum or already happening consumption. And then the marginal propensity to consume, that is just a function saying this is how much each dollar of income gets spent on consumption for every dollar increase in income. Investment. This is the relationship of investment and causes that downward sloping part that you see because as interest rate rises, being the R function in the investment formula there, as that increases, that will lower overall GDP and output because this is the term that captures how sensitive business investment is to the cost of borrowing. So a higher interest rate will be less borrowing and therefore a lower GDP. Onto the government. Government spending is simple. It's just exogenous. It is determined by policy, not by variables. And when G goes up, it just shifts the entire IS curve to the right because it directly adds to aggregate demand. And net exports depends on the exchange rate E, and domestic income Y, and foreign income Y prime. A weaker exchange rate would boost exports, and higher domestic income would raise imports because consumers have more money to spend, and therefore they'll be importing more goods, and vice versa for foreign. So if foreign consumers have more income to spend, they will export more goods from our country because for them it is imported. And then when you substitute all four components into the equilibrium condition, you get the IS curve, and that is a downward sloping relationship between R and Y, or interest rate and output. The LM curve is that curve sloping upwards, almost seeming to mirror the IS curve from the graph on the previous slide. That represents the money market equilibrium. And the formula for that is M over P equals L as a function of R and Y, R being interest rate and Y being income. So if you were to expand that out, you'll get M over P is equal to KY minus HR, and K is income sensitivity of money demand. And that just means that as income rises, you need more money to facilitate more transactions. And H is interest sensitivity of money demand, which just means as interest rates rise, holding money becomes more expensive and you could be earning interest instead, so people will demand less. Looking at the left side, you will see M is nominal money supply set by central bank, and then P is price level, which is fixed in the short run. So M over P will give us the real money supply available currently. And so equilibrium requires these to be equal. If income were to rise, money demand would rise, which creates upward pressure on interest rate to choke off some of that demand. And that's why you see LM sloping upwards as you move to the right, and monetary policy is shifting the whole curve to the left or the right, because monetary policy is just increasing or decreasing the money supply, which is M. So increasing that or decreasing that will just shift the whole curve instead of sliding along the curve. The BP curve stands for balance of payments. This is just the current account and the capital account summed, and you will often see this set equal to zero, meaning money flowing out through trade must equal money flowing in through investment and vice versa. The first part of the formula is that CA as a function of exchange rate, domestic income, and foreign income. It is essentially net exports improving when your currency depreciates, making your goods cheaper abroad, or when foreign income rises, and it'll worsen when your own income rises because you were to import more. The capital account, which is the second part there, KA, is a function of R minus R prime. That is the interest rate differential, or the capital account. And this tracks financial flows. So if your domestic interest rate is higher than other countries, then money will flow in from foreign investors looking for that higher return. And then if your rate is lower, then your own investors will invest elsewhere to get those higher returns, causing capital outflow. Now, the critical assumption is perfect capital mobility. We'll cover this more in the limitations. We don't really see this exactly perfect capital mobility in the real world, but it is close enough. When you're under perfect capital mobility, the entire BP equation collapses to a simple R equals R prime, causing that horizontal slope, setting the interest rate at whatever the global rate is. And we'll talk about that more in the limitations slide. Recap of all the curves. You have the IS of y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. It slopes downwards, and fiscal policy will shift it left or right. The LM curve, which is m over p equals L of r and y, slopes upward, and monetary policy will shift it left or right. And the BP curve, which is just R equals R prime, and under perfect capital mobility, it is a flat horizontal line, and enforced by capital flows. Equilibrium is where all three intersect on the graph, and then that will set the output at your fixed interest rate. Now, what happens when the government tries to move that equilibrium? They'll shift one curve, and then the other two will respond. BP may stay the same, and then if you were to move through fiscal policy, the IS curve, then the LM curve will end up moving with it through some factors that we'll cover later. And the way the system settles will give us a new equilibrium at a different interest rate or output. Bit of a closer look at the diagram itself. You have the IS curve sloping down, the LM curve sloping up, and the balance of payments being that horizontal line there. An important thing to note is that this is a 2D slice of the three-dimensional model. The first two variables you see here are interest rate on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. The third axis being exchange rate. So as the exchange rate changes, you'll see these curves move because it's like intersecting planes, not lines. But holding it fixed will give us this 2D model. And when we move on to policy analysis in the next slides, what changes is whether the exchange rate is locked with a fixed policy or whether it's free to find at a new level in a floating rate. And then that's what changes, which curves move and why. This is the impossible trinity, also called the trilemma. It's probably the most famous concept that the model produces, and the idea is simple. Fixed exchange rate, free capital mobility, and independent monetary policy are all things a country would like to have simultaneously. Number one, because a fixed exchange rate is stable, predictable, and there's no nasty surprises for businesses. Number two is the free capital mobility. Money can flow in and out freely, which would attract investments. And independent monetary policy allows you to set your own interest rates based on your economy's needs. But the Mundell-Fleming model proves that you can only pick two. You cannot have all three at once. And here's the intuition for why. If you fix your exchange rate and allow free capital mobility, your interest rate is immediately set, tied to the world rate, and the moment you try to change it, capital will flood in or out to arbitrage the difference, and your exchange rate would break, and you've lost your monetary independence. On to comparing fixed rate and floating rate monetary and fiscal policy. So first up is the fixed rate and fiscal policy and why this works together. Step one, when the government spends more, the IS curve will shift to the right and output would start to rise, as so do interest rates. Step two, the higher interest rates would attract foreign investors and capital would flood in from abroad. And all that incoming capital creates demand for the domestic currency, which would push it above the fixed rate. The central bank can't let that happen. It's defending the peg, so it'll sell domestic currency to absorb the inflow. That automatically expands the money supply, and LM will shift to the right. That extra money reinforces the original stimulus, and you get a double boost of fiscal policy plus an automatic monetary expansion. And the result is fiscal policy is extremely effective under a fixed exchange rate with perfect capital mobility. You spend money, and the system amplifies any effects from the policy changes. Monetary policy would not work in a fixed rate economy. So you start off, the central bank expands the money supply, for example, and the LM would shift right. Interest rates fall below the world rate. Immediately, investors notice the domestic returns are lower, capital flows out, and they take their money to countries with better rates. That outflow reduces demand for the domestic currency. The currency starts to depreciate and it falls below the fixed rate. Now the central bank has a problem. It must defend the peg, so it buys back the domestic currency. That purchase removes money from circulation. The money supply shrinks right back to where it started, and LM returns to its original position. The net effect being exactly zero. The monetary expansion was completely reversed by defense of the peg, and monetary policy is ineffective under a fixed rate, and the system will cancel itself out. Now, for a floating rate economy, monetary policy is highly effective because the central bank will, for example, choose to expand money supply. The LM will shift to the right and rates will fall. Capital will flow out, the same as before, because domestic rates are now below the world rate. And here's where the difference comes. There is no peg to defend, so the currency is free to move, and it will just depreciate, and it weakens in the market. And a weaker currency means your exports just got cheaper for every foreign buyer. Demand for your goods surges internationally, and net exports rise sharply, and that drives the GDP higher. The exchange rate depreciation is the transmission mechanism, and the central bank didn't need to spend anything or directly stimulate demand. It just let the currency fall, and exports did the work. This is what Japan has done repeatedly. Monetary policy in a floating rate regime is extremely powerful. Last combination, the floating rate fiscal policy. This one is the most counterintuitive of them all to me. The government spends more, and IS will shift right, and the GDP and rates start to rise. The higher rates attract capital inflow because investors love higher returns, And all that incoming capital increases demand for the domestic currency, and with no peg to defend, the currency appreciates and it strengthens freely. A stronger currency is bad for exporters. Their goods now cost more for foreign buyers and exports fall. And this export decline is so precisely calibrated that it exactly offsets the government spending increase. The fiscal stimulus crowds out exports rather than private investment, and the exchange rate becomes the adjustment mechanism that neutralizes the policy. So fiscal policy essentially just does not work under a floating rate with perfect capital mobility, that being the key assumption there. In the real world, there isn't perfect mobility between investments or capital exchange. So there is beautiful symmetry here that what works in one regime will fail in the other and vice versa. Summarize everything all in a neat little table. Under fixed exchange rate fiscal policies, the main weapon of monetary policy is nearly useless. Under a floating exchange rate, monetary policy is the main choice, and fiscal policy being useless there. The mechanism in each case is the exchange rate itself. Either it's locked and that constraint amplifies or kills your policies, or it's free to move and it either transmits or negates your efforts. Key insight being exchange rate regime doesn't change what a country is trying to do. It only changes which lever actually allows the country to reach its goals. This is why it matters so much for international financial management. If you're advising a firm or a government operating across multiple countries, you need to know the regime before you can predict how policy will behave. Before I wrap up, I want to take a step back and look at the assumptions that is baked into the model that we just covered. The results, obviously, depending on these assumptions being true. First and most important is that this is a short-run model only. Every result we walk through, fiscal policy working under fixed rates and monetary policy working under floating rates, all of that depends on prices being completely fixed. The moment you let prices adjust, which they inevitably do in the long run, the transmission mechanisms change and clean results start to break down. Mundell-Fleming tells you the direction of the impact, not the long-run destination. And second, we actually touched on this when we cover the BP curve. The model assumes perfect capital mobility, capital responds instantly and without friction to any interest rate differential. In reality, like I said, they face regulatory barriers, transaction costs, political risk, and investment mobility. Liquidity, I should say. The model overstates how fast and completely arbitrage can happen. Third, there are no expectations built in. The model treats policy as a surprise every time, but in real financial markets, they're forward-looking, and if traders expect a central bank to expand money supply next month, they act today. So you'll see stuff like priced in before it could ever happen. This is a static model in a dynamic world. And fourth, it ignores the price level entirely, which means it has nothing useful to say about stagflation or supply shocks. The 1970s oil crisis, for example, is completely outside the model's scope. So to be clear, these limitations don't make the model wrong. They just define when it can and cannot be used, and how reliable it'll be in the real world. In conclusion, the Mundell-Fleming model is built from three curves: IS for the goods market, LM for the money market, and BP for the external balance. Together, they describe short-run equilibrium in an open economy. The impossible trinity tells us every country must make a sacrifice. You cannot have a fixed rate, free capital, and independent monetary policy all at the same time. And the policy results flow directly from that choice. If you fix your exchange rate, fiscal policy becomes your most powerful tool. And monetary policy is neutralized, and if your exchange rate is floating, monetary policy becomes dominant, and fiscal policy gets crowded out through the exchange rate. Exchange rate is always the mechanism. It either amplifies your policy or it cancels it out. And why does this matter? Most importantly, is because every multinational firm, every treasury department, every investment bank needs to understand how the host country's exchange rate regime shapes policy behavior. It determines interest rate volatility, currency risk, and hedging strategy. These are the references I used. The primary sources being the original papers from Mundell and Fleming. Important note I would say is that Dornbush has a critique of the model, and I think it's very interesting. And I'd recommend you guys go read about it on your own time. You can just find it on the Wikipedia page about the Mundell-Fleming model, and it's at the bottom. Just go click the links and find the real paper that the article's based on.